The 1990s, a decade where hip-hop and grunge reshaped the soundtrack of a generation, where social injustices were pushed into the spotlight, and a certain president made headlines for more than just politics. It was a time when technology exploded, the internet arrived, portable phones shrank, and computers finally felt personal. And in the middle of it all, video games transformed forever. We left behind the simple, colorful 2D sprites of the cartridge era and stepped into a bold new world of 3D polygons, CD-based systems, and cinematic gameplay experiences. This is the decade where gaming grew up, where innovation, competition, and a little bit of chaos defined a generation of players. Welcome to the complete history of 1990s video game consoles.
There's an easier way to get color. Get a Game Gear, the full color portable with over 150 games, like the new Echo, Mortal 2, and Sonic Triple Trouble. Sega!
The story of the Game Gear starts in 1979. This is when Milton Bradley released the first handheld system with interchangeable games, called the Microvision. This handheld instituted a new technology, the LCD dot matrix screen. Before this, only simple LCD screens such as calculators and watches were made. However, the technology just was not perfected yet, and the Microvision was plagued with screen rot issues, leading to its quick demise. Though handheld games were still popular, games like Mattel's electronic sports games, Coleco's tabletops, and Nintendo's Game & Watches were selling really well. By the mid-1980s, the video game market went through the Great Crash, and Nintendo, a little-known company besides in Japan, took off with the release of the NES. Sega had been competing with Nintendo in the Japanese game market with consoles like the SG-1000 and the Mark II. However, they never really gained a foothold in the Japanese marketplace against the Famicom. And then in 1985, Sega released the Sega Mark III in Japan, and then in 1986, they released a redesigned Mark III called the Master System to compete with Nintendo's NES in North America. By 1987, Nintendo and Sega were in a full console war. Nintendo was still king of the consoles, even in North America. To stay on top, they had to come up with another great system. With the success of the Game & Watches, Nintendo saw a great opportunity in the handheld market. When they started the design of the Game Boy, Nintendo went all the way back to the Microvision days and created a handheld with interchangeable games and a modernized dot matrix screen. In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy, and it was a phenomenon. Sales of the system skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Sega released their new 16-bit home console, the Mega Drive, or better known as the Genesis here in North America. Sales of the system were slow in Japan, but in North America and Europe, they took off. Sega was finally outselling Nintendo's NES. Now they had their sights on the handheld market that Nintendo had took by storm. In mid-1989, Project Mercury was started. This was the code name given to Sega's handheld prototype. The project was spearheaded by Sega lead engineer Hideki Sato. He wanted a portable game system that had a color backlit screen. And by this time, the technology that was used in the Sega Master System could be shrunk down small enough to power a new handheld that would keep R&D costs down to a minimum. But Sato didn't want it to be just a new handheld portable Master System, so they got to work updating the old VDP or video display processor. By the time they were done, they developed a much better VDP that provided 4,096 colors, which was 64 times the amount of colors that the Sega Master System produced with only 64 colors. Also during this time, a new competitor entered the handheld market, Atari with their Lynx handheld, and unlike the Game Boy, the Lynx had a color backlit screen. Now Sega had two competitors, Nintendo and Atari. Atari released the Lynx in November of 1989. And to make matters worse, Sega heard that another competitor was developing their color backlit handheld, NEC with the PC Engine GT and Turbo Express handhelds. Development of the new Mercury project was completed in early 1990, and the system was renamed Game Gear. This was a name chosen by Michael Katz, Sega of America's CEO. The Game Gear was released in Japan on October 6, 1990. It was then debuted at the 1991 Winter CES show with positive reviews. Folks liked the color backlit screen and the games that were shown. Initial sales of the system were good. More than 40,000 units sold in the first 2 days in Japan, and they sold more than 90,000 units in the first 2 months, with over 600,000 units on backorder. The Game Gear then released in North America and in Europe in April of 1991 and in Australia in 1992. Sales in North America and Europe started good as well, selling over 100,000 units in the first few months. However, things were not as good as they seemed. With the system taking 6 AA batteries and battery life only being between 4 to 6 hours, where the Game Boy got well over 20 hours of battery life off the 4 AA batteries. Complaints started to come in. Sega tried a few different things to help. They released a rechargeable NiCad battery pack that clipped onto your belt and plugged into the Game Gear, giving it between 8 to 12 hours of gameplay, but it still was well behind what the Game Boy battery life was. Sega also released a battery that attached to the back of the Game Gear, but people complained that it made the console too heavy and too thick to play comfortably. The last thing that Sega did to try to conserve on power consumption, they integrated most of the chips into one. The CPU, VDP, and SCA chips were all combined into one ASIC chip, but this did little to conserve on power. Then the consumers started to complain about the lack of third-party games. Sega did have some third parties making games for them, but just like on the home consoles, Nintendo had contracts with most third parties, and their games never made it to Sega systems. By 1995, sales of the Game Gear had slumped horribly. Sega knew that they had lost to the Game Boy and released the Sega Nomad, a portable Sega Genesis. They did this to try to get a stronger hold on the handheld market and to keep the aging Genesis alive for a bit longer. But by 1997, the writing was on the wall. Sega discontinued the Game Gear. Sega had refocused their efforts on the home console market and the upcoming Dreamcast. Through its lifespan, the Game Gear had a few cool accessories. They released a TV tuner for it so you could watch your favorite TV shows on the go. They also released the Game Link, a cable that linked 2 Game Gears together so you could play 2-player games together. Pretty cool. Then there was also the FM tuner released for the system. Sega also released the Master System adapter that allowed you to play Sega Master System games on the Game Gear. The Sega Game Gear had a 7-year lifespan from 1990 till 1997. During that time, they sold over 10 million units worldwide and had over 350 games available for the system, being Sega's first and best-selling handheld.
Decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing feeling. When you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come, the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The story of the SNES starts in 1987. A newcomer to the gaming industry, NEC, had just released the 16-bit PC Engine in Japan. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had seen NEC and its product as a strong competitor to the NES, which started to worry Nintendo. At this point, sales of the NES were still great, but Yamauchi knew this would not last long with the great graphics and sound that the PC Engine was able to produce. Also in 1987, it was announced that Sega was about to launch their 16-bit system, the Mega Drive. In September of 1987, Nintendo announced the development of the Super Famicom and a new Super Mario Bros. 4 game. The system was being developed by none other than
Masayuki Uemura,
who had developed the NES. Nintendo at this time was worried more about the NEC than Sega. The reason for this is that Sega had released a few consoles in the 8-bit era, but were completely overshadowed by the Famicom and the NES. Nintendo was really not in a hurry to develop the new 16-bit system because sales of the NES were still going good. However, this did not last long. Some feel Nintendo made this announcement in 1987 to stall sales of the PC Engine during the Christmas season. In 1988, Sega released the Mega Drive, and the PC Engine was picking up steam as well. NES sales started to slump, and Nintendo knew they had to get a new system on the market. Development went into full swing, but since Nintendo was so late to the game, it took a couple years to develop. The first prototypes of the system were shown to the public in 1988, and again before its launch in Japan in 1989. In 1989, both Sega and NEC had released their systems in North America, but changed the names to TurboGrafx 16 and the Sega Genesis. By the time the Super Famicom was ready to be launched, Sega was starting to take a lead in the gaming industry. With a good amount of games in its library, NEC was no slouch either. Nintendo, for the first time, had to deal with true competition. This marked one of the greatest console wars in history, Sega versus Nintendo. Nintendo released the Super Famicom in 1990 in Japan, and it instantly sold out of the 300,000 units that were made. The system was then released in North America under the name Super Nintendo in 1991. Also around this time, Nintendo was aware of the CD add-on that Sega was about to release and wanted one for their own Super NES system, so it could stay competitive. They had contracted out with Sony to develop the CD add-on named, you guessed it, the PlayStation. However, during the CES show in 1991, Nintendo reneged on their deal with Sony to produce it and went with Philips. Possibly one of the worst mistakes Nintendo ever made, birthing a monster in the gaming industry to this day, Sony's PlayStation. Philips went on to develop the CDI when Nintendo discontinued the CD add-on, but Philips still had a contract with Nintendo. This is why we have those weird CDI Zelda and Mario games like Hotel Mario and Zelda's Adventure. Once again, Nintendo had a lot of publishers developing for it, and unlike the Genesis, the games could be enhanced with special chips in the carts for sound and graphics. Also, it was capable of pseudo 3D graphics. During this time, sales of the system skyrocketed. As most older gamers used the Genesis, younger gamers chose the SNES. This was all part of the console war. This is a strategy that worked atop Sega then, but would not work on future consoles, as it was shown by Sony's marketing of the PS1 to older gamers in the market, while Nintendo was still marketing to kids with the N64. The SNES went on to sell just under 50 million units worldwide, being launched in 1990 in Japan and finally being discontinued in the UK in 2005, giving this system an amazing 15-year lifespan, making it one of the longest-lasting game systems to ever hit the market.
More power, arcade-like 4-dimensional graphics, and 15-channel stereo sound. Neo-Geo is no stopping us now.
The story of the Neo-Geo starts in the early 1970s. In 1973, businessman and former boxer Eikichi Kawasaki acquired an electronic engineering company and renamed it Shin Nihon Kikaku, which means a new Japan project in Japanese. There's not much information on what the company produced during this time, but it is thought that they made electronic components and parts, As the 1970s rolled along, Kawasaki saw that the coin-op arcade business was growing and wanted to be part of it. On July 22, 1978, the company reorganized and became Shin Nihon Kikaku Corporation and started designing coin-op arcade games. That same year, their first game was produced. It was a clone of the popular arcade game Breakout called Mekon Kit. They produced a series of these games, with one called Battleship Yamato, based on the popular anime series Space Battleship Yamato. In 1979, they released a Space Invaders type game called Ozma Wars. And in 1980, Safari Rally was released, a maze type game. By 1981, SNK was doing well and decided to open up operations in the US in Sunnyvale, California, to distribute their machines in the North American market. They hired on John Rowe to run operations in the US. Also, in 1981, SNK released their first successful game, Vanguard. It was distributed by Century and Cinematronics in North America and by SNK themselves in Japan. It was a scrolling shooter like Scramble or Super Cobra, but with differences that made it stand out and made gameplay fun and addictive. After the success with Vanguard, SNK went on to create over 20 more arcade machines up to 1986. The most popular of these was Akari Warriors. It was so popular that it was ported to several home computers and game consoles such as the Commodore 64, Atari 2600, and the NES. It was during this time that John Rowe left SNK to form Tradewest and was replaced by Paul Jacobs. In 1985, SNK opened a second American branch called SNK Home Entertainment. It also became an official third-party licensee for Nintendo's Famicom and NES. In 1988, SNK started to design a new type of arcade machine. It would be based off SNK and Alpha Dinshi's own M68000 arcade boards using the Motorola 68000 processor. SNK took it a step further with their version, the SNK M68000, which added enhancements to the original SNK Alpha Dinshi board. From here, Alpha Dinshi engineer Eiji Fukatsu created what was called the Neo-Geo hardware. He added more enhancements to the SNK M68000, such as the Yamaha YM2610 FM sound chip with dedicated sound RAM and a Z80 coprocessor for sound. On top of that, sprite scaling was added and stored on ROM in scaling tables, and support for more memory was added. It was also capable of playing more than one game that the user could choose from, calling it the MVS or Multiple Video System, a similar idea that Nintendo had with its Player's Choice cabinets. Which, speaking of Nintendo, SNK released its first home console game made specifically for the NES and was not an arcade port. This was Baseball Stars. This was followed by Crystallis in 1990. By 1990, SNK created another division of the company called Neo-Geo, which all the MVS technology would fall under. Development of the new MVS machine was finished and the system was released. It was the first system to use the name Neo-Geo. The MVS part of the system was essentially designed by Takashi Nishiyama and featured either 1, 2, 4, or 6 game configurations. The games themselves were relatively cheap at $500 a piece, saving arcade owners money from buying multiple machines for thousands and saving floor space in the arcades by having several games in one cabinet. This made the MVS system very popular with arcade owners, and the amazing games made it popular with the gamers. Some of the early MVS games included Baseball Stars Professional, Nom 1975, Top Players Golf, and Ninja Combat. After saying for years that they didn't want to enter the console market, they did. The Neo-Geo AES, or Advanced Entertainment System, was developed from the MVS system using the same components minus the multiple cartridge slots. As advanced as the AES was, it came with a price. Being released in Japan first in 1990 and then in North America in 1991 for the price of $649.99. That was a lot of money then. In fact, with inflation, that comes to just over $1,500 in 2024 money. just crazy expensive and priced a lot of people out of buying one. But this was never intended to be marketed to the consumer. When it released, it was supposed to be sold to commercial customers for use as rentals such as at hotels and motels. However, people that played the systems liked them so much, they were willing to pay the huge amount of money for the experience of the arcade at home. It was at this point that SNK changed their marketing strategy for the AES and expanded the marketing to the regular consumer. SNK didn't want to give the consumer a dumbed-down arcade experience like other console manufacturers of the time like Nintendo and Sega were doing. They wanted to give people the true arcade experience at home. And really, that's just what they did. The games were the exact same games that were in the arcade. They even developed a memory card that could be used between the AES and the MVS systems for game saves and character saves. Gamers loved the console, if they could afford it. At the time, it was considered the best console you could buy. I was a teenager at the time, and I can tell you everybody was talking about this console. But nobody had one. It was like the holy grail of gaming, and Neo-Geo knew it. Marketing was just a couple of low-budget commercials telling you where to buy it. They had no intention of throwing a bunch of money into its commercials or its marketing.
You wanted more power, arcade-like 4-dimensional graphics, and 15-channel stereo sound. Neo-Geo is no stopping us now.
But time waits for nobody, including game consoles. As technology advanced and the next-gen consoles were due to come out, such as the PlayStation and the Saturn, in 1994 they released the Neo-Geo CD in Japan. This console was released as a cost savings to the consumer. Instead of having to buy the pricey AES cartridges, now you could have the same games but on the cheaper CD format. But even before it launched, complaints about its load times became a huge issue. The Neo-Geo CD was released in North America in 1996, but sales were slow. The Neo-Geo was being passed over for the 3D graphics of the PS1, N64, and the Saturn. Plus, Sega's next-gen 3D system was on the horizon, the Dreamcast. The end was knocking on the door for the Neo-Geo. In 1997, both the AES and the Neo-Geo CD were discontinued. NVS production lasted a little while longer, but ended as well. Well, that brings us to the end of the Neo-Geo story. The Neo-Geo will always be known for being a powerhouse in the early 1990s console market. Some say this console was the beginning of the end for the arcade. Do you guys agree with that? The Neo-Geo had a 7-year lifespan, from 1990 to 1997, selling just under 1 million units with the AES and CD combined.
You're dancing to your favorite CD and someone says,
I can see it, man, I can see it!
And you're thinking, loser. But actually it's a premonition.
It's CDI, friends, next generation CD player that works with your TV.
I see amazing movies, man. I see incredible games. I see this whole world. That guy creeps me out.
I think he's kind of interesting.
Now get into CDI starting at $2.99 with 3 titles free, including Burn Cycle.
The story of the Philips CDI starts in the early 1970s. Philips was working on a new technology called the video disc. Philips enhanced this technology by making a reflective back surface on the disc, which made reading the disc much more reliable. They enhanced the video disc technology into what we know today as the laser disc, the big LP-sized disc that could play motion pictures. Several companies wanted a piece of this technology and invested in it, such as Sony, Panasonic, and Pioneer. And in 1978, the Laserdisc was introduced to the consumer market. It was also at this time that Philips knew the Laserdisc technology had its limits. Philips then partnered with Sony to create a new disc standard that would be compact in size and be able to support several different format specifications that would be developed in the future. Philips worked on the technology and Sony worked on the hardware. These discs would be much smaller in size than the original Laserdisc format and have the capability to hold over 700 megabytes of data and 74 minutes of stereo audio. The new standards would be classified in what was called rainbow books. The first of these books was the Red Book. This incorporated the first standards for the new compact disc. The first use of the CD was for CD-DA, or compact disc digital audio. Also, the CD plus G standard was created for karaoke machines. This allowed for audio playback with text and graphics synced to the music so people could karaoke. The new audio CD technology was ready by 1982, and Sony released the first CD player in Japan, the CDP-101. The first CD to be released was also Billy Joel's 1978 album, 52nd Street. It was released on October 1st, 1982, at the same time that Sony released the CDP-101 CD player. During this time, Philips, still working with Sony, started development of the Yellow Book of Standards. While current computers use tape and magnetic disk drives for software loading, these standards were slow and unreliable. Philips saw the need for a new read-only memory solution. What better than the new CD standard? In 1983, they came up with the CD-ROM format. This format went on to be used in computers and game consoles starting in the mid-1980s. Then in 1983, electronic company Pioneer purchased a majority of the rights to the Laserdisc technology. This is when Philips realized they needed to come up with another format for the CD. So once again, they partnered with Sony to design the hardware while they worked on the format itself. The new format would be part of the new Rainbow Book, the Green Book. This format would have the ability to play audio, video, and display pictures, text, and graphics, and have educational software and interactive games. This new format would be called CDI, or CD Interactive. This format became a standard in 1986. While the CD format wars were just starting, another war was starting to brew as well. The console war between Sega and Nintendo was just starting to ignite. While in Japan, PC manufacturer NEC just released the first 16-bit console, the PC Engine, in 1987. By 1988, NEC released the first CD-ROM based system, the CD-ROM expansion, bringing CD-based technology to the gaming industry for the first time. Also in 1988, Philips released the first CDI player, the CDI 100 modular system for professionals and developers, with the help of Sony's development of the hardware. This was developed to be used with businesses and in education. But really, it became the first development platform. Now, while the PC Engine was not released in North America, it came in the form of the TurboGrafx 16 in 1989 and the Turbo CD shortly after. Just when Sega was pulling ahead of Nintendo in the console market, NEC was taking that share away, at least in Japan. Sega knew they had to come up with a CD-ROM based system as well to stay competitive. Now, while all this was going on, Nintendo was working on their new 16-bit game console, the Super Famicom, or as we know it as the SNES in North America. Nintendo released the Super Famicom in Japan in 1990 and in North America in 1991. Just as they released the SNES in North America, Sega released the CD-ROM expansion unit, the Sega CD. Now there were two CD-ROM based systems on the market, and Nintendo wanted in on the CD craze as well. But contraire, mon frere. Nintendo was already prepared for this. Nintendo knew early on that Sega was developing a CD-ROM based expansion unit, so in 1988 they contacted Sony about a possible partnership to develop a CD-ROM based expansion for the upcoming SNES. Development of the new expansion unit commenced. Sony once again partnered with Philips to create a new CD-ROM format for the system called the Super Disc, and Sony would continue doing what they do and do the hardware part of it. Development continued until Sony finished the prototype and dubbed it the PlayStation. In early 1991, the prototype was pretty much finished. Sony and Nintendo was in negotiations for a deal on the licensing of the games released on the system. Now, Sony, since they put most of the work into the project, proposed that they would retain the rights to the games released on the system, leaving Nintendo with a small profit margin on the sales. But this was not the business model that Nintendo wanted to be part of. They had been in control of licensing for the games on their consoles since the launch of the NES. and they did not want to give up the rights to their games. So secretly, Nintendo started negotiations with Philips to make the disc-based system instead of Sony, making sure that Nintendo still had full control over the licensing. By spring of 1991, word had spread to the media that Sony and Nintendo had partnered for a CD-based expansion system. Before this, Nintendo never spoke a word of it. Then the 1991 Summer CES show came. The first day of the show, Nintendo announced its partnership with Sony, to the delight of the crowd. However, right after the announcement, Nintendo went behind Sony's back and signed a deal with Philips to release the CD-based system instead. This is because Philips wouldn't retain rights to the games, and this is what Nintendo wanted all along. The next day, Nintendo announced that they would now be working with Philips for the new CD system. This not only took Sony by surprise, but the media as well, because they knew that Sony and Nintendo had been working on the project for years. But through it all, Nintendo granted Sony permission to continue making the game system and using the technology and releasing it under Sony's name. But Sony ultimately decided against this and started designing a new, more powerful system, the PlayStation as we know it today, and it became one of Nintendo's biggest rivals and a juggernaut in the gaming industry to this day. Meanwhile, Nintendo started working on another CD-based system with Philips. Philips was going to use the same Super CD format that they had been developing for the PlayStation expansion. However, Philips had always worked with Sony for the hardware side of things, and they were behind the curve on the hardware development part of it. Nintendo saw this and knew it would be a while even for a prototype to be built, so they nixed the entire CD expansion project for the SNES. While breaking the deal with Philips, they stated that they could still use the IPs such as Mario and Zelda in games for the system that they developed. For the first and only time since the NES, Nintendo licensed their IPs to another game console. Philips decided to use the CDI format over the CD-ROM for the new system. Really, Philips just wanted to market the CDI disc format, not as a games console or player as they called it, but just the format itself. Early in the CDI development, they created a spec minimum on all CDI players based off the Motorola 68000 CPU. Their intent was to have other manufacturers license and build the players themselves. So there were some companies that were interested, such as Goldstar, Kyocera, and Sony, among others. In late 1991, Philips released of CDI players. Now keep in mind, the CDI technology was never intended to be a game console, but it was marketed as an interactive CD multimedia player. During the first couple of months of release, 18 interactive multimedia CDs and 20 games were released for the system. The games were very basic, like Battleship, Connect 4, jigsaw puzzles, with the best game being a port of Defender of the Crown. It truly was an incredible device for consumers that bought it for what it was, a CD interactive player. It was capable of CD audio, CD plus G karaoke, video CD, full motion video with the optional MPEG video cartridge, and with its built-in OS, it could be made to play games. Later, an add-on modem was made to connect it to the internet as well. It was a device to make your old CRT TV a smart TV, in 90s terms that is. Bill Gates was even quoted as saying he was worried about the CDI competing with the PC and game console market because Philips had its full commitment into the CDI format. However, the CDI was grouped into the game console market. The folks that bought it for this purpose were not impressed with its price tag and its subpar gameplay, not to mention its horrible infrared controller. The sales of the system were slow, but steady. Philips was determined to push the CDI format. They continued to develop several different series of players. The 300 series were portable players specifically targeted for use in the sales market as multimedia sales pitch devices for marketing teams to take with them on business trips. The 400 series were cost-reduced top-loading models specifically designed for the gaming market, with a newer, even worse wired controller. The 500 series was really about the same as the 400, but with the optional MPEG video cartridge included. The 600 series was a professional version of the system that supported keyboards, floppy drives, and was designed as a development system. Other companies licensed the CDI technology as well and used it in their products, such as Gold Star, which released a professional series of players targeting the business and sales markets. Sony also released a portable player, the Sony CDI Intelligent Discman IVO. What a cool little device. This thing is worth a pretty penny these days. However, by 1994, sales had slumped. Other consoles such as Sega's Genesis and Nintendo's Super Nintendo were dominating the console market that the CDI was delegated to. This is when they decided to release the Nintendo IP games: Hotel Mario, Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon, Link, The Faces of Evil, and Zelda's Adventure. As we all know, the strategy didn't work and the games were hugely criticized. They are considered some of the worst games ever made. This tarnished the CDI's reputation even more. Sales of the system and software remained low, but Philips kept pushing, even starting a design for the next generation of CDI. However, the writing was on the wall for not only the CDI player, but for the format itself. With the launch of the DVD format in 1996 and its capabilities, it was all but over. The CDI kept on until 1998 when the product line was discontinued, but the CDI didn't die there. CD Online, the online service, continued in the UK until the year 2000 and in the Netherlands until 2007. Ultimately, all things come to an end. Between 1991 and 1998, Philips sold around 500,000 units worldwide. Many people disliked the CDI, calling it the world's worst video game console. If you look at the time it was released, multimedia was a huge thing. The CDI filled a certain niche. A person that didn't own a computer and wanted an interactive multimedia player instead of a game console. It was a device more for watching videos, listening to music, singing along to the music with its karaoke capabilities, multimedia software like visual encyclopedias, and later its ability to access the internet to shop, check the news, do email, and chat with friends. All without having to own a computer and just using your own TV. That's what its intended purpose was, and that's what it did very well.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em! Want to see more?
The story of the Sega CD really starts in Japan in 1988. NEC was rumored to release a CD-ROM based system by the end of the year. Sega had just released the Sega Mega Drive in Japan to compete with the 16-bit PC Engine, but NEC was looking to step up the game with an add-on to the PC Engine called the PC Engine CD-ROM. Sega knew that the CD-ROM was the media of the future and decided to develop its own add-on CD-ROM system for the Sega Mega Drive. Sega did not have the capability to make its own CD-ROM system, so it partnered with JVC to help. Sega enlisted
Tomio Takami to lead this project.
Sega wanted a CD-ROM based system that could match or even outperform the PC Engine CD-ROM. They originally decided to double the amount of RAM that the NEC version had, but this was not enough. Rumors started to fly that NEC was developing a different, more powerful CD add-on that was to be called the Super CD-ROM, that would have up to 512 kilobytes of RAM. Sega upped the ante and decided to put 6 megabits of RAM into this system. But that was not all. They also decided to add another Motorola 68000 CPU, but clocked at 12.5 MHz, almost twice the speed of the Mega Drive CPU. On top of this, they added a custom GPU that could perform scaling and rotation effects. Also, not to be outdone with audio, they included a custom Riot sound chip that was capable of producing 10 channels of sound of audio, partnered with what the Mega Drive's YM2612 and SN76489 chips were providing for the system sound. The system would be able to play games, audio CDs, CDG video discs, and karaoke discs. The Mega CD was released in December of 1991 in Japan with only 2 games, Heavy Nova and Soul Feast. Other games released later that month included Nostalgia 1907, Ernest Evans, Funky Horror Band, and Tinka Fabu. But it wasn't until months later that games really started to hit the market. This led to sales in Japan being strong at first, but dying off quickly because the system really didn't have a great library at launch. During the development of the system, Sega was very protective of the technology that went into it. In fact, they were so secretive about it, they didn't even release a real version to Sega of America until it was almost too late. Sega of America had to procure its own ROM to put into the dummy unit to make it functional. To their dismay, the system had some major issues. The CD drive tray mechanism was flimsy and prone to break, but the worst issue was with the CD drive mech itself drawing too much current and releasing magic smoke from the system's capacitors. Rumor has it that the units actually caught on fire, but this is truly just a rumor. Only the caps blew, causing the system to smoke. The system was revised and released in North America as the Sega CD. When the Sega CD released in North America in October of '92, it was promised to have at least 20 games at launch, but Sega was not able to do this. It launched with 4 games. Unlike Japan, games started to be made right away, and by the end of the year, there were 15 games published. Reception of the system is mixed. The system itself and the technology behind it was good, but the lack of games at launch time and the overuse of full motion video really didn't appeal to too many people. As time went on, the system never really caught on, but many great games were made for it. Also, games like Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers were instrumental at the beginning of the ESRB ratings for video games due to their sexual and violent content. The Sega CD was released in Japan in 1991 and discontinued in 1996, giving the console a 5-year lifespan. Although it seemed to be unpopular, it did sell over 2.2 million units with a total of 205 games being made. In my eyes, that's a pretty successful system for an add-on.
CD の数だけ番組が増える学べる遊べるみんなに楽しい富士通の FM タウンズマーティ新登場
今ならすぐに使える体験 CD がもらえるよ詳しくはお店で
The story of the FM Towns Marty starts in the early 1980s in Japan. During this time, several major computing manufacturers were competing in the 8-bit computing market. A couple of these companies were NEC and Fujitsu. In 1981, NEC had released the PC-88, a Z80-compatible 8-bit computer. Then in 1982, Fujitsu released the FM7 8-bit computer to compete with NEC. It was a Motorola 6809-based computer. There were other competitors in the Japanese market, such as Sharp's X1 and the MSX computer line. Amongst all the competition, NEC and Fujitsu gained a huge chunk in the professional, educational, and home computing markets. By late 1982, NEC had released the PC 9800 series. These were based off the Intel 8086 architecture, essentially IBM PC clones that were capable of running MS-DOS. To keep up, Fujitsu released the FMR series of computers in 1986. These were also x86 based computers capable of running MS-DOS and were popular in the office and professional market, being able to run software like Lotus 123, WordStar, and DBase. By the late 1980s, NEC had tried something different and it released its first video game console, the PC Engine. Fujitsu needed to stay up with competition. They had seen NEC starting to dabble in video games, and computers like Commodore's Amiga and Atari's ST were becoming very popular in the market. Not only were these machines powerful, but they had great graphics, excellent sound, had multitasking, and were multimedia capable as well. Now, multimedia was a new term in the late 1980s, and everybody wanted to jump on board and be able to watch videos, listen to music, play games, and eventually even surf the web on just one device. Fujitsu saw this and started development of their own multimedia computer. During its development, Fujitsu liked to codename their products after Nobel Prize winners. They decided to codename this product Towns after Charles Towns, the Nobel Prize winner of 1964 in physics. This new model of computer would run the Intel 386SX processor at 16 MHz and have 1 or 2 megabytes of RAM, expandable up to 6 megabytes. Although it didn't come with a hard drive, one could be installed using a SCSI card. Fujitsu decided to stick with the codename Towns and name the new model the Fujitsu Microcomputer Towns, or better known as the FM Towns. It released in 1989. Several models of the FM Towns were made through the years, starting with the first-gen original gray towers, the Model 1 and the Model 2. These eventually evolved into the CX series, along with the all-in-one UX series in 1991. And in 1992, a desktop version, the HG series, premiered, along with another all-in-one version, the UG series. All these computers were 386 based and were MS-DOS compatible. However, the FM Towns had its own graphical user interface operating system called Towns OS. This OS was pretty impressive during its time, and being based off MS-DOS like Windows 3.0, the FM Towns had attracted a lot of game developers, and a lot of great games were made for the system, from ports to exclusives. By 1992, Fujitsu had seen NEC enter the gaming market in Japan and abroad, and the success it was having. Then Commodore had released the CD-TV, a multimedia-based Amiga computer. So they decided why not take a shot and started to design their own multimedia gaming platform. The design would be based off the 386SX with 2 megabytes of RAM, a CD-ROM drive, and a floppy drive. It would also be backward compatible with older FM Towns software, giving it a huge library of games to start off with. A 5-button D-pad controller with a select, run, A, B, and shoulder button for changing screen resolution and display modes was made for the system too. You could also connect a keyboard and a mouse to the system while loading Towns OS on the built-in floppy drive to have a computer right in your living room. In essence, they just cost-reduced the FM Towns base model computer into a gaming platform, but I must admit, the design cues of the console are a work of art. I mean, look at it, it's kind of a beautiful console. The FM Towns released in February of 1993, only in Japan. The name of the console remains a mystery. Some claim that the name derives from the popularity of Back to the Future and Marty McFly, but this has never been proven. Others claim that the name is just a fun Western name to show it was a fun console. But others have said that it's a play on words regarding the Sega Mega Drive. I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. Regardless, the console released to not much fanfare, and it was seen as the lesser model of the FM Towns computer with no ability for expansion and no hard drive. Sales were slow but steady, and by December of 1993, the system had sold around 45,000 units. Shortly after this, Fujitsu announced that they would be releasing the FM Towns Marty 2, but they had never divulged any technical specs on the console. The media and the public speculated that the console would have the 486SX running at least 20 MHz like the new UR series of FM Town computers. The Marty 2 released later in 1994 and featured a darker shell and cheaper price, but that was about it. There really was no differences at all between the Marty 1 and the Marty 2. Also in 1994, they released the FM Towns Car Marty, an even smaller form factor portable Marty that you could take with you on the go. Designed to connect to TVs and Japanese luxury cars like the Toyota Century. Sales of the system actually increased after the release of the cheaper Marty 2. The Marty had found a small niche market of dedicated followers, but the writing was on the wall for the computer-turned-console concept. It had never really been a success for Fujitsu, just like other companies before had tried it, like Atari with the 5200 and the XEGS, and Commodore with the CD-TV, CD32, and the C64GS. Fujitsu was losing money on the Marty, and it was time to pull the plug. In 1995, the Marty was discontinued. However, the Marty does hold its place in history, as it was the world's first 32-bit game console to be released. The Commodore CD32, another early 32-bit game console, didn't release until 7 months later in September of 1993. Sales numbers of the system are questionable. Sources I've read state both the Marty 1 and 2 combined sold about 55 to 65,000 units in total in its short 2-year lifespan. Although the Marty really didn't gain traction, it was a very capable gaming platform with some great titles from well-known publishers. However, a lot of the games from the FM Towns library were not compatible with the Marty. Most of the incompatibility came from only having 2 megabytes of RAM. A lot of the games required 4 megabytes or more to just run. Another issue, the video display incompatibilities were really an issue too. The FM Towns games were designed to run on an RGB monitor and not over composite or S-video. When starting games, you have to manually configure the display setting each time you just want to play the game. This frustrated users of the system. And the nail in the coffin, in my opinion, was the release of the Marty 2 and all the hype behind it, just for the same system in a different color shell. The public was expecting upgrades and expandability, but that just wasn't the case, and this lost consumer confidence in the product. I mean, sales of the system did increase for a little while after the Marty 2's release, just because of the cheaper price, but those sales tanked after just a couple of months. Well, that brings us to the end of the FM Towns Marty story. Although the console was discontinued, the computer lived on with several different models being made. The last FM Towns computer was the HC series running a Pentium 90 MHz processor with 8 MB of onboard RAM, expandable up to 136 MB. Although these were the most powerful FM Towns computers, they were also the closest to PC clones and had lost much of their FM Towns identity, being specifically designed for MS-DOS and Windows. And that brings us to the end, as the FM Towns computer line was discontinued in 1997 as Fujitsu focused their computing business model on laptops.
I never found out why he chose me to share his secret. Perhaps because we had similar dreams. But this was twice as fast, twice as powerful as anything I'd ever thought possible. Though what that meant, I could never have foreseen. Incredible graphics and colors, so many colors. The same again.
The story of the Amiga CD32 starts in the late 1970s at Atari. Nolan Bushnell had recently sold Atari to Warner Communication because of financial issues Atari was having at the time. Once Warner took over, the work culture at Atari had changed. Atari programmers were not getting the credit for the games they were making, and instead of developing the next game console, Atari used the technology that was supposed to be used in the latest console to develop their first computer. And this frustrated many folks that worked at Atari at the time. This is when Nolan Bushnell left Atari. Jay Miner, who had helped develop the technology that was supposed to go on the next game console, wanted to create another console using the Motorola 68000 CPU. Atari nixed the idea, and this is when Miner left Atari as well. Also around this time, several programmers left Atari. A few went off to form a new game company named Activision. These programmers were David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead. Larry Kaplan worked to get investors on the new computer project. He hired Miner, who had been out of the industry for a couple years, and started a new company called High Toro. High Toro was established in 1982 with David Morse as CEO and with Kaplan and Miner working on development. Initially, they started the company to create a new game system. This game system would be based on the Motorola 68000 CPU and was being built on breadboards. It was codenamed the Lorraine, named after David Morris's wife, Lorraine. Shortly after that, Kaplan was contacted by Nolan Bushnell. Bushnell convinced him to leave High-Toro and come with him to develop a new system, as it would be better financially for him. Kaplan agreed and left High-Toro, which proved to be a bad decision. In Kaplan's own words, Bushnell flaked out on their deal and it never happened. Meanwhile, over at High-Toro, Miner was promoted to lead engineer and started working with R.J. Mickle and Dale Luck to finish the Lorraine. It was also at this time that the company's name was changed from High-Toro to Amiga. By late 1983, the prototype was finished. Although the IC dies were still not developed, the system ran off several breadboards with discrete logic components making up what would soon be Amiga's custom chips. But all this came at a price, and Amiga was losing money fast. In January of 1984, two important things happened. Jack Tramiel resigned at Commodore, and the Lorraine would be demoed at the CES show. Amiga still hadn't developed much software for it. In fact, the system didn't even have an operating system or BIOS yet. But what it did have was one amazing program. We all know it as Boing, the bouncing ball, which later became the logo for Amiga. Patrons attending the show were amazed by the graphics of the 3D animated ball. Some even accused the Amiga team of hooking a different computer up to it to accomplish what they were seeing. This is when Atari saw the Lorraine and wanted to develop their next-gen game console from the technology. Amiga and Atari had even started development of a game console named the 1850 XLD. Then the video game crash of North America started in full swing. Atari lost over $1 million in 1 week and Warner Communications won it out. So talks and development with Amiga came to a standstill, all the while Amiga was on the brink of bankruptcy. In June of '84, Jack Tramiel bought Atari. During his brief time between this and Commodore, he started Tramiel Technology. He recruited most of the high-ranking engineers from Commodore to come along with him. They had started development on their own 68,000 base computer, but the Lorraine was further along. Jack knew Amiga was on the brink of bankruptcy and knew they were desperate and it was time to make his move. Atari gave Amiga a 1-month loan of $500,000 to keep Amiga afloat. If they didn't pay it back, Atari would acquire all the rights to the Lorraine technology, basically putting Amiga out of business. For Amiga, this gave them 1 more month to find an investor before Atari took it all. Now over at Commodore, Irving Gould now ruled everything. He put Marshall F. Smith as CEO of Commodore. Commodore at this time was hurting for engineers because most had left the company to join Jack at Atari, so they needed a new computer. Talks between Commodore and Amiga started. First, Commodore offered Amiga just a licensing agreement worth $4 million, but soon changed it to an outright buying of Amiga for $24 million. Amiga agreed to this, and Amiga became a subsidiary of Commodore. By late 1984, the breadboards from the Lorraine became the Amiga's custom chips such as the Agnes, Denise, and Paula, which is known as the OCS or Original Chipset. In 1985, the Amiga, or later known as the Amiga 1000, was launched. 2 years later, the most successful Amigas were launched, the Amiga 500 and the Amiga 2000, both using the OCS. Now from here on, I'm really going to hit the fast forward button. Sorry Amiga fans, I'm not going to go through every Amiga computer, but let me explain to the folks out there that from 1987 to 1992, 2 more chipsets were introduced to the Amiga. The enhanced chipset, which improved screen resolution and other video improvements. Then later, starting with the Amiga 4000, the Advanced Graphics Architecture, or AGA, was introduced, a true 32-bit graphical chipset. Now, continuing with the fast forwarding, by 1993, as a whole, Commodore was just hurting financially. Irving Gould was running the company into the ground, and sales of all the Amiga models were low, and sales of the outdated Commodore 64 was almost nothing. The company at this point had been through several CEOs since Jack's departure. things were looking bleak. But there might be a silver lining, making the Amiga do what the Amiga was designed to do, be a game console. Commodore had tried this in the past a couple of times with the Commodore 64 game system, which was just an absolute failure, and then with the Amiga CD TV, which wasn't very successful either. But things were different this time. This was a true 32-bit CD game system in 1992, right during the height of the 5th gen CD-ROM craze. Commodore was literally banking on this to keep the company going. They started to design the prototype, codenamed Spellbound. Really, it was just a consoleized Amiga 1200 with a CD-ROM running the AGA chipset, put into, dare I say, a pretty nice looking case, with design cues of the Sega Genesis. Then, right around this time, one of the worst things that could have happened to Commodore did. They got sued for patent infringement. Apparently, Commodore infringed on XOR's technology that used different parts of the display, such as the mouse pointer, menus, and dragging, and it also managed and controlled the memory for this. They went to US court, and Commodore was ordered to pay $10 million. This couldn't have come at a worse time for Commodore. The CD32 was released on September 17, 1993 in the UK, and the rest of Europe shortly after. It was very successful due to the Amiga's popularity in Europe and its compatibility with other Amiga hardware and software. Things were actually looking pretty good for the system. Then later in September, Commodore demoed the CD32 at the World Amiga Show in Pasadena, California. They said that the unit would be shipped to some US cities by Christmas and have a full launch by January of 1994. However, time was not on Commodore's side. The deadline to pay off the $10 million debt was up, and now the US government put an injunction on Commodore that they could not do business in the United States until the debt was paid. Commodore had already produced thousands of consoles for the US and Canadian market, but the shipment was held up in the Philippines until the lawsuit and the debt to the Philippine console manufacturing plant and shippers was paid. In the European market, where the console was doing very well, Commodore could not keep up with the demand because there was a supply shortage of parts, and I'm assuming that's from all the parts that were used in the consoles for the US that were held up in the Philippines. This was the final nail in the coffin for Commodore. By April of 1994, they declared bankruptcy and all Commodore products were discontinued, even the CD32. But this isn't the end of the CD32 story. After Commodore dissolved, several companies bought the Amiga CD32s that were held up. Some were used in museums for information display units. One of the more popular uses was by an Italian company named CD Express. They created an arcade cabinet built around the Amiga CD32 called the Kubo CD32. Just a few games were made, most of which were puzzle games. Also, some Amiga CD32 motherboards were known to run slot and video poker machines from the early 2000s. Well, that brings us to the end of the CD32 story, a sad ending to a once great company, a good example of what poor management can do. Although the CD32 isn't well known in the US, it was very successful in Europe, selling over 125,000 units in its short 7-month lifespan, and being the last product Commodore made.
You're working late tonight.
The passive type probably plays Nintendo.
You're working late tonight. I can't. I got therapy.
The aggressive type probably plays Sega.
You're working late tonight.
Could we try that with a knock?
And the other type definitely plays 3DO, the most advanced home gaming system in the universe.
3DO from Panasonic, Gold Star, and Creative Labs. Now $3.99 plus free games.
The story of the 3DO starts in 1989. This is when Dave Needle, an Amiga engineer, and RJ Michael, designer of the Atari Lynx, were having lunch together and drew up a design of a new game console on a napkin. Shortly after this, Needle and Michael's friend, EA founder Trip Hawkins, wanted to design a new game console, a next-gen 32-bit CD-based multimedia console. He spoke with Needle and Michael, and they showed him the design they drew up while eating lunch that day. Hawkins liked the design. In fact, he liked it so much he decided to partner with Needle and Michael to create a new company. And instead of trying to come up with a new design from scratch, he would use what they were already working on. Unlike other game console makers at the time, Hawkins didn't want to manufacture the systems. He wanted to license the technology to other companies to manufacture the consoles. This was a new business model that no one had ever tried before. Up to this point, console makers produced the consoles, usually at a loss, only to make a profit in licenses of games sold for the system. Really, it's the same business model that's used today. But Hawkins wanted to try out this new way of making consoles. The 3DO company was established on September 12, 1991. Around the same time, Hawkins stepped down as CEO of EA to run 3DO, but he still remained on EA's board until 1994. Larry Probst became EA's CEO. At this point, Hawkins started talks with other electronic companies to try to bring them on board to manufacture the 3DO. He even went to competitors like Sega. Tom Kalinske of Sega stated that they were in serious talks with 3DO to make the console, but pulled out due to the cost of making the console. Hawkins' main company he really wanted to partner with was Sony and Panasonic, two of Japan's biggest electronic manufacturers. Sony was not interested because they were already fully involved with the development of the PlayStation. Panasonic, on the other hand, liked the idea and wanted in. Other companies bought licenses too, such as Toshiba, AT&T, and Samsung, but none of these companies ever produced the console due to its high manufacturing cost. Panasonic was full in on the new console and designed what was called the Panasonic FZ1 3DO. They were first released in October of 1993 for a launch price of $699. These systems were marketed to high-end gamers and folks wanting the newest gen console. After the launch of the Panasonic 3DO, two other companies bought licenses and started making their own versions of the 3DO, Sanyo and Gold Star. Those 3DO systems were sold for much less. The Gold Star 3DO sold for $399, $300 less than the Panasonic FZ1 version. After 6 months on the market, Panasonic lowered the price of the FZ1 model to $499 while working on a cheaper, cost-reduced version to soon be released. Things seemed to be going okay with the launch, but things were not as they seemed. Initially, they were going to release the system with 5 launch titles: FIFA International Soccer, Jurassic Park Interactive, Return Fire, Road Rash, and Crash and Burn. But because developers were having issues working with the new high-end technology, and the fact that 3DO kept changing the hardware for the console, only made one game, and that was Crash and Burn. That wasn't the only issue they faced at launch time. Panasonic, the only manufacturer making the system at launch, did not have enough made to fulfill orders. This left retailers with only 2 or 3 per store at launch. Because of this, and pricing, only 30,000 units had sold by the end of November 1993. By March of 1994, 6 games were ready for the Japanese release of the console. The Japanese release did much better than the North American, selling over 70,000 units in the first few weeks. But soon, Sony released the PlayStation and Sega released the Saturn, bringing sales of the 3DO to a standstill. 3DO had claimed it was the most powerful console on the market. Until the PlayStation and the Saturn came out, that was the truth. To help with sales numbers, 3DO lowered the cost of all 3DOs to $299, making manufacturers take a $100 loss on each console sold. It was at this point 3DO really needed to do something and do something fast. They announced an add-on device called the M2. This was an accelerator to make the system more powerful than the PlayStation or the Saturn. They even started development of a whole new console based off the M2 technology. But sales of the console continued to fall. By December 1995, 3DO reduced the cost of the system even further to $199, hoping to increase sales. By early 1996, Gold Star dropped out of the agreement to make 3DOs. This was the beginning of the end. By spring, all third-party developers announced they were not making games for the system anymore. And by the end of the second quarter, 3DO's own software division stopped making games, leaving Panasonic as the only developer. By the end of 1996, the writing was on the wall. 3DO discontinued the console, and divested its technology. 3DO restructured the company and sold off their hardware division to become a software company. Selling its hardware to Samsung, Samsung used the hardware to release consoles called the DMB800 in South Korea. But by early 1999, they too discontinued it due to poor sales. Well, that brings us to the end of the 3DO story. People may wonder why it wasn't successful. The hardware at the time of its release was actually pretty powerful. There were a few factors that did them in. One was the business model of having other manufacturers make the consoles. Only one other company had tried this and failed as well, Apple with the Pippin Atmark and the Pippin Atworld. But they did even worse than 3DO. This is because manufacturing consoles is always the money loser. Software sales and licensing is where they make the money. Just ask Microsoft, have they ever turned a profit on the Xbox sales yet? The other reason the 3DO failed was price. $699 in 1993 was an astonishing amount of money. Not too many people could afford it. Then there were the games. Not too many developers jumped on the 3DO bandwagon, making the licensed hardware manufacturers develop software. Probably not the best idea since they were already in the hole due to hardware costs. The 3DO had about a 3-year lifespan from 1993 to 1996, selling just over 2 million units worldwide and being the first video game console developer to have other companies license their tech to make the consoles. A unique business model that just couldn't cut it with the big console manufacturers like Sony and Sega at the time.
Do you believe your system is the most advanced in the universe? Let's review the numbers. Sega Genesis is 16 bits, 3DO is 32 bits, the Atari Jaguar is 64 bits. Which is more advanced? Clifford! 16 and 32 are less than 64. So with 64 bits, 3D graphics, real-world animation, and lightning speed that you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced? Clifford!
Can you repeat the question?
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
The story of the Atari Jaguar actually starts in the mid-1980s with 4 different companies: Atari, Commodore, Sinclair, and Flare Technologies. Commodore's longtime president, Jack Tramiel, jumped ship from Commodore to Atari in 1984. At this point, Tramiel focused on selling the existing inventory of Atari's products and creating a new line of computers capable of competing with Apple's Macintosh, the Atari ST. In the late 1980s, Tramiel wanted to design a new series of video game consoles for Atari. This is where Sinclair and Flare Technology comes into play. Flare Technologies was part of Sinclair, and they started designing a new computer called the Loki. Unfortunately for Flare, the Loki didn't pan out and was cancelled. Flare Technologies was headed by Martin Brennan, Ben Cheese, and John Matheson. Flare started working with Amstrad and developed a system called the Flare 1. The Flare 1 was intended to be a home computer or a video game console, but the chipset was actually used in countertop arcade game cabinets for trivia machines. Eventually, the chipset was further developed into the Kinect's multi-system prototype. This was also cancelled, but caught the eye of Jack Tramiel. In 1989, Jack Tramiel contacted Flare Technologies and made a deal to buy Flare and make it a subsidiary of Atari, calling it Flare 2. Tramiel asked them to create 2 game consoles, a 32-bit and a 64-bit one, using the Flare 2 technology that was used in the Kinect system. They started to work on both the 32-bit, codenamed the Panther, and the 64-bit, codenamed Jaguar consoles. Work on the Jaguar console proved to be going a lot faster, advancing further, leading to the Panther's cancellation. In 1993, the Jaguar was unveiled at the Chicago Consumer Electronics Show. Also, there was a test launch of the Jaguar, which saw all of the 20,000 units that were brought sold out. Atari at this point thought that they had a big hit on their hands. The Jaguar was launched on November 23, 1993 at a price of $249.99. Most of the games were not very popular, but there were a few good games. Tempest 2000, Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, and Alien vs. Predators were all released in 1993. As the consoles were starting to sell and people started buying and playing the games, one thing came to the forefront. Gamers realized the games didn't look like they were on a 64-bit system, maybe 32-bit, but not quite 64-bit. Consumers started questioning whether the Jaguar was truly a 64-bit system. Because of this, Atari kinda limped along for a couple more years until 1995, with the arrival of the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation sealing the final nail in the coffin for the Jaguar. But we'll take a quick pause here. I want to show you guys a few peripherals that were designed for the Jaguar. The first being the Pro Controller, giving you additional buttons and being designed for fighting games. Then there was the JagLink, which was a network device to connect Jaguars together for multiplayer games. Then in 1995, they released the Jaguar CD and memory track module. But unfortunately for Atari, this was not enough to save the Jaguar. By late 1995, rumors started circulating that the Jaguar was going to be discontinued in April of 1996, which it was. Then Atari agreed to merge with JTS Incorporated, and on July 30th of that year, the merger was completed. After the merger with JTS, most of the Jaguar inventory remained unsold and was moved to a private liquidator called Tiger Software in 1996. In 1998, JTS sold the Atari name and all of its Atari properties to Hasbro. But here's some interesting information about Atari and JTS. They ended up selling the console shells to a dental imaging company, which produced an imaging machine using the shells of the Atari Jaguar. Unfortunately, only a few were produced as the technology changed and the company used different products. So that brings us to the end of the Atari Jaguar story. However, it never truly died. In 1998, the Jaguar became an open source system, and many great homebrew games have been made for it. In fact, the homebrew games tend to be a little bit better than the original Jaguar games that were released by Atari. So if you ever have a chance to check out the homebrew scene on the Jaguar, it's excellent. The Jaguar did not have a very long lifespan. It started in 1993 and was discontinued in 1996, selling less than 150,000 units in total, and being the very last video game console made by Atari. Well, at least the Atari that we all grew up with.
The machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his powers. 32.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Increase the power of your 40 times.
Thank you.
The story of the 32X started in January of 1994. Sega president Hayao Nakayama was worried about the Atari Jaguar that was released in November of '93, taking a share of the gaming market away from Sega. This was due to the fact that Sega was already working on Project Saturn, but it was not scheduled to be released until late 1994 in Japan and mid-1995 in North America. He was so worried that during the CES show, he called Joe Miller, head of Sega of America's R&D department, and conferenced in Sega of America's producer, Scott Bayless, Sega of America's vice president of technology, Marty France, and Sega hardware team, Hideki Sato, advising them of developing a quick response to the Jaguar. After the phone call, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske argued that they could get another year of life out of the Genesis without the need of another system. Sega of Japan disagreed and wanted a whole new system design. This started the development of Project Jupiter, a whole new system based off the Genesis. This new system would have been a 32-bit system with an upgraded color palette and some 3D capabilities. But Miller disagreed with this idea, stating that if you're just going to upgrade the same system, you might as well just make an add-on for it. Sega of Japan and America compromised, and another add-on was made for the Genesis. They discontinued Project Jupiter and started Project Mars. The Sega of America team headed the Mars project. They designed it to use 2 of the 32-bit Super H2 Hitachi CPUs that were developed in 1993 jointly with Sega for use in the Saturn. But for this project, the clock speed was reduced. The system would be able to use the Sega Genesis CPU, GPU, and sound chips. If you had the Sega CD, it could use its hardware as well. Although only 5 games were released in the CD format that used the Genesis, Sega CD and 32X's hardware altogether. Although the system's design was more powerful than originally conceived using the Saturn's processors, it was not going to be compatible with the Saturn, being its own system. The system was marketed to people who wanted to get into the 32-bit gaming market but couldn't afford the upcoming Saturn. It was also seen as a transitional device between the 16-bit Genesis and the 32-bit Saturn. The 32X was released in November of 1994 in North America for $159, at the same time the Saturn was being released in Japan. Sales of the unit were initially strong. Over 1 million units were ordered, but Sega was only able to produce 600,000 units by the end of 1994, due to the shortage of CPUs being used in the Saturn as well. By Christmas of '94, 500,000 units were already sold, exceeding Sega's expectations. 6 games were available at launch at the price of $69.99 apiece. It didn't take long for consumers to see that the system was not as good as the hype around it. Development of the system was difficult, making it hard for Sega to secure publishers for games. Most publishers wanted to make games for the upcoming Saturn and not this transitional system. Sega sent out development kits, but by this time it was too late. Game publishers bailed on the 32X, with only a total of 40 games being made for the system, most being rushed out and not being completed. Sega was impressed with the sales figures early in the release. They started development of another system, the Sega Neptune. This was to be a Sega Genesis and 32X in one console, but soon after this, the media was starting to be very critical about Sega's strategy. Word got out about the games, and the price point, and sales started to plummet. Several of the publishers for the 32X, such as Capcom and Konami, bailed at this point. This was the beginning of the end for the 32X. By mid-1995, it was clear to Sega that the 32X was not going to be successful, and they ordered Sega of America to concentrate its efforts on the Saturn. By September of '95, the price of the units were decreased to $99. By 1996, the system was discontinued, and a fire sale started, trying to clear out the remaining inventory, selling the units for $19.99 apiece. Sega had made the same mistake Atari had made, competing with itself. Also, the fact that the system was difficult to develop games for, the publishers bailed, and the price was just too high for an add-on, led to the death of the system. In the process, they lost consumer confidence as consumers saw the 32X as just a greedy money grab between the Genesis and the Saturn. That brings us to the end of the 32X. It had a very short 2-year lifespan, starting in 1994 and being discontinued in 1996, with just over 800,000 units being sold, making it Sega's worst commercial failure.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century. Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aww, hit it! Sega's next-generation gaming platform, revolutionary sports and arcade gameplay, all with amazing new 3D experiences never before possible on home game systems. Wow.
Sega Saturn. It's how you play the game. Go farther than you have ever gone before. Sega Saturn. Play your games in the 21st century and leave the rest of the world behind.
The story of the Sega Saturn starts in 1992. Sega knew they had to come up with the next-gen video game console to stay competitive in the gaming market. Sega's Hideki Sato headed the development team of the new console, codenamed Project Saturn. By 1993, Sega teamed up with Hitachi to develop a new 32-bit RISC CPU that would be used in the new console. The new processor would be called the Super H RISC Engine, or SH2 for short. The Saturn would be developed around a dual SH2 configuration. Sega was mostly finished with the design of the Saturn by the end of 1993, but info was leaked about the upcoming Sony PlayStation, and Sega decided to add another video display processor to the Saturn to improve 2D performance and 3D texturing too. This gave the Saturn 2 VDPs as well. During this time, Tom Kalinske didn't like the architecture of the Saturn and wanted to go with supercomputer maker Silicon Graphics for its 3D chips and design. Sega of Japan didn't like this idea. Nintendo later contracted with Silicon Graphics for the development of the N64. Also in 1993, Sega restructured its internal game studios to better suit development of 3D games. They enlisted Team Andromeda, which were part of the arcade development team, to design 3D games for the new console. In early 1994, the Sega Titan arcade system came to be, based off the Saturn's architecture, Acclaim being the developer for it in the United States. In early 1994, per orders of Sega of Japan, Sega of America started development of the 32-bit add-on for the Sega Genesis called the 32X. This was to be a transitional device between the Genesis and the Saturn, for people who could not afford the upcoming Saturn. It would use much of the same hardware as the Saturn, such as the SH2 CPUs, but would be incompatible. Sega of America president Tom Kalinske did not like the idea of the 32X, wanting to instead get at least another year of life out of the Genesis with no more add-ons. He just saw it as a bad idea, but Sega continued on with the development of the two 32-bit systems that would launch at the same time in 1994, the Saturn in Japan and the 32X in North America. The Saturn released in November of 1994 in Japan with the pack-in game of Virtual Fighter. The initial 200,000 units were sold out in the first day. Sega waited to release more units to the market until December 3rd, 1994, the day the PlayStation released in Japan, to stymie their sales. By the time 1994 was over, Sega had sold more than 500,000 units, while the PlayStation had only sold 300,000 units. This did not last long though, as the sales of the PS1 took off in 1995, leaving the Saturn behind. Sony started to attract more third-party developers due to the cheap licensing fee of only $10 and a well-designed development kit. In March of 1995, Kalinske announced the Saturn would be launched September 2nd in the United States. However, Sega of Japan wanted the console to be released earlier. During the E3 show on May the 11th, Kalinske announced the release of the Saturn for the price of $399. 30,000 units were shipped out to Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique, and Software etc., and available for sale that day. This enraged other retailers that were not advised of the release. Stores such as Best Buy, Walmart, and KB Toys stopped selling Sega products because of this. During the E3 show, PlayStation announced they would release their console at a price of $299, to the applause of the crowd.
Some of you might actually want to know what that price is. Since it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles, I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
All this started to make Sega look bad. With its release in the US, only 6 games were ready with the pack-in game Virtual Fighter. This game was not as popular in the United States as it was in Japan, making more people wait for the PlayStation release. People started to compare games such as Daytona USA versus Ridge Racer on the PlayStation. There was a noticeable difference with Ridge Racer being almost arcade quality, while Daytona USA was just not as good as the arcade. In October, Sega announced a price reduction of the Saturn to $299, the same as the PlayStation. However, not to be outdone, Sony announced in May of 1996 another price reduction to $199. The next day, Sega announced their price reduction to the same amount as the PlayStation's. But for Sega, they were now losing money on each console they sold. By 1995, Sega still accounted for 40% of the US gaming market, but with the arrival of the PlayStation, things were taking a dramatic swing. By 1996, Galinsky, which wanted to just continue on with the Genesis until the launch of the Saturn, wanted out of Sega. He left in September of 1996, and that started a shakeup at Sega of America. Several people either quit or moved positions, as Sega of America was being reformed. Also in 1996, Sega of America STI team was developing a new 3D Sonic game for the 32X. But since the 32X was being discontinued, it was now to be released on the Saturn. The game was to be called Sonic Extreme, and to be a fully immersive 3D world, a first for a Sonic game. The game was being rushed to be completed by December of 1996. However, the lead programmer quit, and several of the other team members got sick, and it was apparent that the game would not be completed by December. Sega canceled the game. Not long after this, the STI team was disbanded. With the cancellation of Sonic Extreme, a lack of third-party developers, being hard to develop for, and retailers refusing to sell Sega products, were all nails in the Saturn's coffin. Sony had taken the lead in the market share for gaming consoles in the US, leaving Sega behind. By 1997, Sony had 47%, Nintendo 40%, and Sega only 12% of the gaming market. By 1998, Sega was almost ready to release the next game console. With sales of the Saturn not doing well in the US and Europe, they decided to call it quits on the Saturn in those regions. It did continue on in Japan for a couple more years until the year 2000, when it was canceled there too. The Sega Saturn had a 6-year lifespan, being released in Japan in 1994 and discontinued in the year 2000, selling 9.26 million units worldwide. The console is considered to be a failure by Sega due to the early release in the US, not enough games at launch, and disagreements internally at Sega leading to bad business decisions.
Are we enjoying ourselves today, folks?
Well, if drinking white wine out of a 4-ounce glass is your idea of enjoyment, see, it's white wine in a 3-ounce glass, red in a 4.
Hey, you with the goatee. 2 words for you, pal. Lighten up. Frenchie, I need an extension cord, some buffalo wings. Go. Au revoir. Raising the roof with the coot. How you doing? Who's bored? Raise your hand. Anybody? Look who's happy now.
PlayStation. The story of the PlayStation really starts with Ken Kutaragi, or better known as the father of the PlayStation. Kutaragi worked behind the scenes with Nintendo to strike a deal to use the SPC 700 sound processor in the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Sony executives found out about this and almost fired him over it, but they decided to keep him on as a protege because the deal was just so damn successful. This started a working relationship with Nintendo. Nintendo decided to contract Sony out to build a CD add-on system for the Super Nintendo. Sony was very eager to get into the gaming market because they saw the profit that was being made by Nintendo and Sega at the time. So to secure maximum profits after they developed the SNES CD, or codenamed PlayStation, Sony was demanding all rights to the games being made on the new CD add-on. This would also transfer over to the Super Nintendo cartridges if they were being used in conjunction with the CD system. 3 years had went by, and it was 1991. At the CES show, Nintendo was showing their partnership with Sony to create the CD add-on system. Nintendo actually made this announcement, but afterwards struck a deal with Philips to make the CD add-on system for Nintendo. The next day at the CES show, this deal was announced. Folks in the gaming industry were just shocked by the news, as Sony and Nintendo's partnership had been going on for over 3 years at this point. It was a total betrayal on Nintendo's part. But Nintendo did not want to lose control over the licensing of their games to another company. Sony continued to work with Nintendo to supply them the chips for the Super Nintendo system. But really after this, there was no more business done between the two companies. And by this time, Sony had developed a standalone version of the PlayStation, which was capable of playing Super Nintendo cartridges. Nintendo would allow Sony to launch the system if they wanted, but Sony actually decided against it. The Sony suits were rethinking their business model on video games. They were really thinking about pulling out of the video game market altogether. But with successful shifting of certain divisions like the music division and creating the Sony Computer Entertainment division, they started developing a new PlayStation console. The new console would have better graphic capabilities, such as polygon 3D graphics. Sony really wanted to distance the new console from the failed attempt that they had with Nintendo. The project was called PlayStation X, or PSX. In 1993, Sony decided to go to several gaming companies to try to promote their new system. Sony at this time didn't have any in-house development, so they had to rely on third-party developers for their games. The technical details of the PlayStation, or how easy it was to develop for, made it an easy decision for developers to jump on board with Sony, including Namco, Konami, and Williams. But Sony needed to have its own in-house development team too, so in 1993, Sony acquired Psygnosis, and I know all you Amiga guys out there know who Psygnosis is. Psygnosis was later renamed to SCE Liverpool. Once Sony purchased Psygnosis, they had a team of over 500 people developing games for them. Although the system was easy to develop for, the development system that Sony had created was not easy, and folks at Psygnosis did not like it. They wanted something that was PC-based and be like something that they were used to and be familiar developing on. So Sony teamed up with a company named SN Systems, and they developed the cards and software for the development system. Now there was PC interconnectivity and the ability to program and compile in GCC, which made development very easy. The PlayStation launched in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, and in North America on September 9th, 1995, and then in Europe on September 29th, 1995. During and after the launch of the PlayStation, Sony tried a different marketing strategy than any other video game manufacturer had tried before, except for Sega. Instead of marketing its game console for kids, it marketed it towards adults and older teenagers. Sony's logic to this was sound. Seeing that a generation of gamers, Generation X, that grew up with Atari and Nintendo were now adults and had expendable cash, and by marketing their console for the older gamer and not being toyish like Nintendo, adults had cash in hand and were ready to go pay for a new game system, while, children didn't. And it made the sales of the PlayStation skyrocket. The PlayStation had several different models, most of which looked the same, but in the year 2000, Sony launched the PS1 as a cost-reduced, smaller version of the console. It actually outsold the PlayStation 2 for the first 2 years after its launch. The PlayStation enjoyed a successful 12-year run, with it being discontinued in 2006 and with more than 102 million units sold.
It came from the third dimension, with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy. See it now in 3D.
The story of the Nintendo Virtual Boy actually starts in the mid-1980s with a company named Reflection Technology Incorporated. They created a stereoscopic head-tracking prototype called the Private Eye, which featured a tank game. Needing funds to support their business ambitions, they went to the Consumer Electronics Show. There they showed the Private Eye prototype off to several companies, including Mattel, Sega, and Hasbro. All those companies declined, but one company in particular showed interest in the Private Eye prototype, and that was Nintendo. Gunpei Yokoi, which was the inventor of the Game & Watch and Game Boy, led the engineering R&D 1 group of Nintendo. He thought the oscillating mirror display technology in the Private Eye was cutting edge. Negotiations started, and Nintendo came to a licensing agreement with Reflections Technology to use their display technology in a new game console. After years of development, the head tracking technology was dropped due to the possibility of health issues for the people using it. But Nintendo kept the oscillating mirror stereoscopic display technology. After several different colors and a full color display was tested, it was found that the red and black screen was cheaper to produce and easier on the eyes for the user. Nintendo predicted the console to be a big seller, even opening a new factory in China specifically for the production of the Virtual Boy. They predicted over 3 million units sold over Christmas time, and over 16 million units of software sold by that time as well. It debuted at the 1995 E3 and the CES shows, but already the reviews were starting to look bad. Many people at the shows had tried out the new console and complained of headaches and eye strain. The Virtual Boy was released in Japan on July 21, 1995, and in North America on August 6, 1995, at a price of $179.95. There were 4 launch games that coincided with its release: Mario Tennis, Red Alarm, Teleroboxer, and Galactic Pinball. After its release, there were several complaints from parents about headaches and eye strain from children. Even though the console warned users to take breaks, kids just didn't listen. Imagine that. Sales of the console plummeted. Nintendo tried dire promotions to show off the 3D capabilities opposed to 2D consoles, but this marketing tactic failed as well. After the Christmas season in 1995 and the slow sales of the Virtual Boy, Nintendo decided to discontinue the production of the console and games. I'm not really sure the exact date of when it was discontinued, but I believe it had an 11-month lifespan. This was Nintendo's worst console failure, selling only 770,000 units in total.
インターネットはテレビで見よう。テレビをあっと変える。ピピンアットマーク誕生。
The story of the Pippin video game system starts in the early 1990s. By then, Apple's market share in the computer business was starting to fade rapidly. With the introduction of the Macintosh in 1984 and its continued line of computers, sales were slumping, and with the planned discontinuation of their biggest moneymaker, the Apple II line, Apple had to come up with a way to expand in the market. They started to think about the possibility of licensed clones of the Macintosh that third parties would produce to try to expand their market share, just like IBM did with the PC. By 1993, Bandai, a toy and game company, wanted to create a new CD-ROM-based next-generation video game console. Bandai had been in the video game market since the early 1980s with limited success. They licensed the rights from Emerson to make the Bandai Arcadia, a clone of the Emerson Arcadia 2001 console in 1982. They also made some games for the Nintendo Famicom and NES through the 1980s. Bandai had heard that Apple was looking to license the Macintosh, and they wanted to make a game system using Mac architecture. In 1994, Bandai met with Apple and came up with the prototype design of a new multimedia video game system based off the Macintosh 2 classic hardware. It would have the same 16 MHz Motorola 68030 CPU and ran Macintosh system software. Apple would handle the design of the logic board, and Bandai would produce the system shell, packaging, and handle the console's marketing. During the development, Apple and Bandai had asked customers what they wanted in a multimedia game system, and overwhelmingly the response was access to the internet. Bandai never intended on having internet connectivity, but Apple was insistent that the Pippin have it. A couple years earlier, Apple had moved away from the standard serial connection with a modem for internet. They now use GeoPort, which used software to emulate the modem to connect to the internet. But to use this technology, the system had to be completely redesigned due to hardware constraints of the 68030 CPU. Apple decided to go with the PowerPC architecture like the current Macs were running. They chose the brand new PowerPC 603 32-bit CPU. Unlike most video game systems, the Pippin would not have a dedicated GPU or sound chip. 2D and 3D graphics were rendered by QuickDraw. Apple had advised third parties to develop 3D rendering hardware for the system if needed. Video for the system is only supported by QuickTime and has no MPEG codec support. In December of 1994, Apple officially announced the Pippin system and their partnership with Bandai. Bandai had planned on launching the console in mid-1995, but unfortunately, the launch date was pushed back to 1996 due to production and development issues. In October of 1995, Mitsubishi Electric agreed to help with production of the console, but never became an official licensee with Apple. In March of 1996, the Bandai Pippin Atmark went on sale in Japan at the cost of 64,800 yen. It included a dial-up modem and 4 bundled games. Bandai CEO Makoto Yamashina stated at the time he thought over 200,000 units would sell by the end of the year. Bandai had spent over $93 million marketing the console in Japan with no help from Apple. Then in June of 1996, the Bandai Pippin At-World was released in the US at a cost of $599. It came bundled with a 6-month unlimited internet account from PSI Net that cost $24.95 per month. Also in June of 1996, a Norwegian company called Cats Media signed a license agreement with Apple to produce the Pippin system. They also signed an agreement with Bandai to produce the hardware for the Cats. Bandai would concentrate its efforts in Japan and the US, while Cats would focus on Europe and Canada. While Bandai marketed the system as a game console, Cats wanted to market it as a multimedia device. They initially wanted to produce 2 systems, the first one just a basic machine capable of running only CD-ROMs, while the other more expensive unit would have internet connectivity. But only one unit was produced. It was named the Cats Media Player 2000. It was available in 2 configurations, one with a rear SCSI port to connect a SCSI device such as a hard drive or floppy drive. The other model did not have the SCSI port. Cats Media never sold the product in the retail market. It attempted to sell it as a set-top box to its media partners such as cable companies and catalogs. Not very many of these were made or sold, which makes the Cats Media Player one of the most rare examples of the Pippin. There were around 60 games made in total for the system, most of which were puzzle and edutainment games. There were also non-game related software made for the system, such as a how-to home improvement CD-ROM and internet browsers. Most of the software development came in-house from Bandai, but there were some third-party developers for the system, but most were small indie developers. This meant the Pippin really had no third-party support like the bigger game companies like Nintendo, Sega, and Sony. This made it increasingly difficult for the Pippin to compete. Also, people complained of the cost of the Pippin compared to the other consoles of the time, and sales never really took off. By 1997, Bandai was losing money fast and had decided to cancel the Pippin At-World in the US due to almost non-existent sales. They sent the unsold units back to Japan to be sold there. Also around this time, Bandai started merger talks with Sega as financially things were looking bleak. Things were not looking good for the Pippin. The unit had been canceled in the US, had slow sales, had unknown publishers making games for it, lacked the 3D power of the Saturn, PlayStation, and N64. The writing was on the wall for Bandai, and unfortunately for them, the merger with Sega did not go through. Then Steve Jobs came back to Apple. When Jobs was at Apple before, he wanted closed systems, and upon his return, it was no different. He canceled all agreements with companies making Mac clones, including the Pippin. By mid-1997, production of the Pippin had stopped, and the system was all but canceled. Cats Media said they would continue to support the Pippin, which it did until its eventual bankruptcy in 1998. Bandai supported the console until December 31st, 2002. The Apple Pippin had a 2-year lifespan, from 1996 to 1997. It was Apple's only venture into the gaming market. It sold just over 42,000 units worldwide, making it one of the worst-selling consoles of all time.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
Nope.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
Let me check. No.
Is it here yet?
Pokemon Stadium 2 will be here on March 28th. Until then, $10 reserves your copy and gets you a collector's edition poster with tons of Pokemon. So you'll be ready to battle with your gold and silver characters in 3D.
Cool. Is it here yet?
No.
Rated E for everyone.
The story of the N64 really starts in the early 1990s. At this point, Nintendo knew that they needed to start development of a new system to replace the Super Nintendo and enter into the next generation of consoles. This is where Silicon Graphics Incorporated, a graphics visualization and supercomputing company, comes into the picture. SGI was looking to expand their company by putting some of their technology into consumer products. Jim Clark, founder of SGI, contacted Sega of America and spoke with Tom Kalinske. Kalinske was impressed with what he saw, but ultimately Sega decided not to buy the technology. After Sega engineers evaluated the hardware and technology, they found several issues with it and offered to buy it outright from SGI. But SGI was not willing to give up the rights to its own technology. After no deal was struck with Sega, Clark then spoke with Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, in early 1993. Nintendo was willing to license the chipset instead of owning it outright, and on August 23, 1993, Nintendo and SGI came to an agreement initiating what would be called Project Reality. The technology from Project Reality was to be used in the arcades as soon as 1994 and in the home console market by 1995. Reality Emergent Technology is the name SGI had given its components used in the Project Reality. Initially, Project Reality was developed into the Onyx supercomputer, costing $100,000 to $250,000. The game development system was filled with Reality Engine 2 graphics boards and 4 150 MHz RISC CPUs. The APIs were based on Performer and OpenGPL. On June 23, 1994, Nintendo announced the official name of its console as the Ultra 64. Developers started signing on with Nintendo, including Rare, Acclaim, DMA Designs, Ocean, and many more. Around this time, the Project Reality team prototyped a game controller for the system. They used the design cues from the SNES controller and added an analog stick with a Z button. This prototype controller eventually became the N64 controller. The design of this controller was so secretive that once developers were done using it, they had to hide it in a lockbox. While development of the console continued, Nintendo and developers started developing games on the Onyx supercomputer-based development system. Eventually, these systems were replaced by cost-reduced SGI Indie workstations, which had fully accurate console simulation boards within the system to help with the ease of development. The console was publicly revealed for the first time in 1994, and showed the console with the Nintendo Ultra 64 logo, a ROM cartridge, but still no controller at the time. In late 1994, Nintendo started licensing agreements with Midway and Williams to create arcade games based on the Ultra 64. These games were Killer Instinct and Cruising USA. Although the Ultra 64 arcade boards were based on the Ultra 64 game console, they used a different chipset with no Reality coprocessor and used hard drives. Also around this time, Nintendo decided to go ahead and rename the game console from the Ultra 64 to the Nintendo 64. This decision was based on Konami, who had ownership of the Ultra Games trademark. Nintendo was afraid they might be sued over trademark infringement, so the name was changed to the Nintendo 64, or better known as the N64. A cool tidbit of information is that the software and the hardware on the N64 still use the NUS prefix, which stands for Nintendo Ultra 64. Originally, the N64 was slated to be released by the Christmas season of 1995. However, due to hardware problems with the chips underperforming, they had to be redesigned again. The delay went on until the spring of 1996. The Nintendo software development kit was completely redesigned as a Windows-based partner N64 system by Kyoto Microcomputers. On June 23, 1996, the N64 was released in Japan, and on September 26, 1996, released in North America. The console was originally slated to be sold in the US for $250, but the launch price was reduced down to $199.99 to make it competitive with Sony and Sega. Nintendo at this point knew that Sony and Sega had basically sewed up the adult and teen market in video games, so the N64 specifically targeted preteens. The N64 was quite a successful console, selling just under 33 million units worldwide. It was eventually discontinued on April 30th, 2002. This gave the N64 a 6-year lifespan.
Ready for it. はかけますよ。僕モテるから。
We got her! Hi, Randy.
Well, hello.
It's thinking.
The story of the Sega Dreamcast starts in 1995. Sega was already looking into their new console. It had been reported that they held meetings with several companies to help in the development, such as Lockheed Martin and 3DO, to name a couple. With the release of the Sega Saturn in 1994, and all the issues surrounding it, such as it being hard to develop for, lack of third-party developers, and issues with US retailers selling Sega products, all had Sega looking for a way out of the Saturn as financial losses were starting to take a toll. By 1996, longtime president of Sega of America, Tom Kalinske, had resigned his position and was replaced by
Soichiro Irimajiri.
And Bernie Stoller became Sega of America's vice president in charge of product development and third-party relations. With the release of the PlayStation and in 1996 the release of the N64, Sega saw sales dwindle. By late 1997, Sega only held on to only 12% of the game console market, with Nintendo being at 40% and Sony at 47%. Due to Sega performing so poorly, Sega president Hayao Nakayama, which had been president of Sega since 1983, stepped down.
Irimajiri
took over the position, with Stoller becoming CEO of Sega of America. At this point, Sega discontinued the Saturn. By 1998, Sega had reported its first consolidated financial loss since 1988 on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. It reported a $269.9 million loss. Now, back in 1997,
Irimajiri
hired on IBM's
Tatsuo Yamamoto
to head on an 11-person team to work on a top-secret project called Black Belt. Also during this time, Sega's Hideki Sato had also started development of a new console. Reports vary whether or not
Irimajiri
had started the two-team development, or if Sato started it on his own. Sato's group decided to go with Hitachi's SH4 processor with the VideoLogic Power VR2 graphics processor by NEC. This project was named White Belt, then changed to Doral, named after the female fighter in the Virtual Fighter game series. Yamamoto's team decided to go in another direction. They decided to go with the 3DFX Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee GPUs and a Motorola PowerPC 600E CPU. Sega's management ultimately decided to go with Sato's design using the SH4 and PowerVR architecture. This decision was thought to have been made because of Sega's relationship with NEC being a Japanese company. Stoller didn't like the idea of the use of the PowerVR GPU and wanted to use the 3DFX GPU, but Sega of Japan ultimately decided to go with the PowerVR, which led to a lawsuit by 3DFX against Sega for breach of contract, and was settled out of court with an undisclosed amount paid out to 3DFX. At this time, the project was renamed again to Project Katana. Also during this time, EA Games was not happy with Sega's decision to go with the PowerVR GPU either. They didn't really know how to program for it, instead wanting Sega to go with the 3DFX. Also, EA wanted an exclusive contract for sports games, which Sega didn't want to do. Because of this decision, no EA games would be available on the Dreamcast, and Sega went on to produce their own sports games along with developer Visual Concepts, which headed the 2K Sports game series. Sega touted the system to be easy to develop for, unlike their previous system, the Saturn. So easy, in fact, that you could make a game that would run on a Pentium 2 200 PC and easily port it over to the new system. Microsoft developed a custom version of Windows CE that ran on the system using DirectX's APIs and dynamic link libraries, making it really easy to port over PC games. Sega also made their own OS to be used in the development of games for the system, with most developers going with it instead of Microsoft's OS, as it had greater performance capabilities. The Katana project was revealed on May 21, 1998 in Tokyo, and Sega held a public naming competition for the new system. Over 5,000 names were submitted, with Dreamcast being the chosen one, thought up by developer Kinji Uno. The name is a combination of the words dream and broadcast. It is said that Sega spent $80 million on hardware development, up to $200 million on software development, and $3 million on promotions and advertisements worldwide getting it ready for launch. The Dreamcast was launched in Japan on November 27, 1998 for the price of 29,000 yen, with 4 games available at launch. Within one day they had sold out of the entire inventory of Dreamcast. Sega at this point hoped to sell more than 1 million units by February of 1999, but only sold 900,000 units, falling short of the mark. Because of this, and the fact that Sony had just leaked info about the upcoming PS2, Sega lowered the price of the unit to 19,900 yen, which helped give Sega 17% of the console market by late 1999. In August of 1999, Stoller had been fired and Peter Moore had took over his position. The Dreamcast launched on September 9, 1999 in North America with 18 games available for the price of $199.99. But Sega had started thinking about the American market and started a contract with Hollywood Video to rent the console out before the launch date, giving people a sneak peek at the console before it actually launched. Sega also repaired its relationships with the American retailers that stopped selling Sega products after the early release of the Saturn. Sega hit a sales record, selling more than 255,000 units in the first 24 hours. By November, Sega had announced that they had sold over 1 million units. Things were looking good for the Dreamcast. But as the launch of the PS2 was coming and more info about it was coming out, sales of the Dreamcast started to slow down. The PS2's GPU is much more powerful, but the thing that kept people from buying the Dreamcast was the fact that the PS2 would be able to play DVDs and have games on DVD, giving games much more space for programs and making bigger and better games. Also, Nintendo announced their next upcoming console, the GameCube, and Microsoft started development of the Xbox. Sales of the Dreamcast dwindled, and Sega reported a net loss of $404 million by March of 2000. Moore had said for the Dreamcast to be viable, it would have to sell 5 million units by the end of the year. Unfortunately, it only sold 3 million, leaving Sega with another loss of 163 million, and by March of 2001, it had went over $417 million in losses. On May 22, 2000, Sega chairman
Isao Okawa
replaced
Irumajiri
as president of Sega. He had always wanted Sega to get out of the hardware market and become just a developer. In September of 2000, Sega held a board meeting and agreed at this point to leave the console market. On January 31, 2001, it was announced that the Dreamcast was to be canceled in March, and Sega reduced the price of the unit to $99 to get rid of the remaining inventory. The price was reduced 2 more times to $79 and then $49. This marked the end of Sega becoming a console manufacturer. It also marked the end of an era, and the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was officially canceled on March 31, 2001. So that brings us to the end of the Dreamcast story. With the console launching in 1998 in Japan and being discontinued worldwide in 2001, gave the system a short 3-year lifespan, selling over 9 million units in total and being Sega's last video game console.